Support for this episode comes from the University of San Francisco's SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, better known as JSSJ. The JSSJ graduate level certificate program in JEDI empowers professionals with invaluable skills, tools, and resources to connect generations and ensure inclusive growth. Courses this spring include Meet the Moment, Fighting Anti-Semitism and Building a Just World, and Dismantling Racism from the Inside Out. The JEDI plus JSSJ program is built around your busy schedule, driven by your individual professional development, and steeped in a rich culture rooted in justice. Learn more and apply now. Go to usfca.edu/JEDI. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 462, ApocryFest 2024. Part 1, Judith. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Lex Rofberg.
And I'm Liana Wertman.
And today is a very, very unbelievably exciting day. We are launching, re-inaugurating, you might say, rededicating in the theme of the holiday of Hanukkah. We are rededicating ApocryFest. This is our third edition of the world's wildest initiative, where we look at a whole slew of books that were not featured in what is now the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, and we try to find ways in which they can actually be Jewish for us and be meaningful for us, even though they haven't always been seen in that way in all eras and all times. Now, we've had many episodes in this sort of series in the past, and we encourage you to check out our past year's approaches to different books of the Apocrypha. This year, we will be revisiting some books that we've talked about in the past and bringing in new ones to add to our cinematic universe that is Apocrypha plus Judaism Unbound plus the Torah Studios. So that's a little bit of a window into what's about to be happening. But before we go super deep, and spoiler alert, today we're going to be looking at the book of Judith. But before we do that, Liana, what's ApocryFest and what is even the word Apocrypha talking about?
Lex, if that's not the exact reason why we're here, let's go further back. We talk about Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, the Jewish canon, everything that happened in our biblical era when there were temples around, before there were temples around. We're talking Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, the books about kings, the books about prophets, the book of Esther. All of these books were essentially codified and canonized into one set. So when the rabbis made their decisions about what was going to go into our canon, that meant that they were also leaving some things out. And those stories are just as old, just as interesting, and sometimes just as referential or even referenced to in the books that we read regularly. And it's really important for us that we go back and look at things that were written about what it meant to be Jewish and about how Jews felt about being Jewish 3,000, 2,000, and 1,000 years ago, and hopefully even a little bit now.
100%. And so the next question that I'll take a crack at is, given what you just said, okay, cool. Listeners, like, great. Apocrypha, there's these other stories. They didn't get counted. We're trying to demarginalize these marginalized texts. Lovely. Why on Hanukkah, though, is the next question. Because we could have ApocryFest be any time of year, and we've chosen to put it with Hanukkah. There are a lot of reasons for this. One, the holiday of Hanukkah is the one holiday on basically today's Jewish calendar or rabbinic Jewish calendar where a book of the Apocrypha is actually really central to the observance of that holiday. So we don't go to synagogue and chant the book of Maccabees like one might with the book of Esther on Purim or other scrolls on other days, but there wouldn't really be a Hanukkah in the form we have it without the book of Maccabees. The rabbis actually didn't like the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, very much, and so they sculpted this holiday that is based on the historical things that happened with these Maccabees, but they very consciously shifted it from being about this story of a bunch of warriors and a battle with the Assyrian Greeks to being about God and miracles. And so they didn't want us to read Maccabees in Shul. We kind of endorse reading the book of Maccabees on Hanukkah and not stopping there, but noticing, we might see this as a gateway drug, as an opening into exploring other books of Apocrypha. And that leads us to today, which is the book of Judith. Judith is less totally core or pivotal to the holiday of Hanukkah historically, but and there are a lot of associations with Judith that have been around not just for like modern times, but for many, many, many centuries. And part of that is because the name Judith, this main character in the book, is tied to the name Judah, like Judah Maccabee. And there seems to be sort of a dialogue happening between those characters. And certainly for those of us who read both of them, we hear them as similar. But so, Liana, can you take us into this book, Judith? Tell us a little bit about what even happens in it.
The book of Judith, similar to the book of Maccabees, tells the story of an Israelite community fighting against oppression, where people were trying to keep them from being able to live out their Jewish life, which I think is probably another reason why we consider them connected. In this story, Judith's town is being sieged by Assyrians, and they can't continue. They're freaking out. They're praying to God, and Judith, a wealthy widow, looks out and goes, all right, your prayers are great, but someone has to actually go out and do something. That's how God works, like through people. So she, and this is my favorite part, she like takes off all her garbs and she gets beautiful. And everyone's like, oh my God, you look so good. And
Judy.
she, I know. And she like struts down to the camp and she's like, hey, everybody, I'm here to party. And the Assyrians are like, yeah, we're in. And they start partying and they hang out. And she ends up like sneaking into Holofernes, the general of the Assyrians' tent. And everyone's like, oh my God, like he's having so much fun. And she's like, yeah, keep whispering. No one listen, because she cuts off his head. And then she sneaks back up to the top of her town. And they're like, oh my God, I can't believe you're back. And she's like, yeah, watch this. And so she like goes, hey, Assyrians, what are you going to do now? And they're like, what are you talking about? And they're like, well, where's your captain? And they're like, oh, he's right over there. And she's like, oh, you mean this guy? And she like holds up his head. And it's just this story of kind of like, what does it mean to be resisting an army that essentially has complete power over you? And I mean, I don't honestly even always remember how it ends. Like the Assyrians do sometimes wipe out parts of our communities in these stories. And I think she ends up saving her community. But it's just a really great story about a woman going out and taking action to keep her people safe.
Yeah, and so I'll directly shout out our episode last year about Judith, where we really dove into this. A few notable things. One, I really like the part of this where Judith is a descendant of the tribe of Shimon, of the tribe of Simeon, it's sometimes said, or Simon, the second of Jacob's children. And I say that because I don't know the agenda. We can't know exactly the why of people putting these books together, what they were seeking to do. For me, these are not history books. They were conscious choices that people decided to write these stories. I do think, though, that one possible why is that we kind of lack for biblical characters tied to a lot of the tribes of Israel. We have a lot of folks who descend from Judah, and even like Judaism, the word is like a shout to Judah, the fourth son of Jacob. We have many that tie to Joseph. We have, a smattering of others, but like many of these 12 tribes really don't have a lot of figures in Jewish tradition who are like explicitly tied to them. And so I actually feel like if we're going to have a Jewish tradition that celebrates the fullness of Jews, we should try to have like fleshed out windows into these different 12 tribes. And so I think it's cool that Judith comes from that tribe that gets a little less airtime in a lot of texts. So that's like a whole side thing about how I like that we're looking for a gap in Jewish tradition and filling it. Now, the obvious gap is like woman hero. We have Esther, but we have very little else. You could argue Ruth and Naomi to some degree. But Yael, who's a very similar story to this, by the way. Yael, like part of me thinks that this didn't make it into the canon because people would be like, it's kind of redundant. We've got two woman is tricky and kills general of army stories. By the way, like the Torah has plenty of stories told twice, so I think it could have done it anyway. But
we have a lot of stories about guys doing the same thing.
Yeah. So we have a bunch of gaps being addressed. And that to me is what Jewish tradition should be at every point. We should be asking, what are the stories that exist for real people, for real Jews, that we're not doing a good job of voicing? And I don't know if that's like the primary why of why Judith came together. I do think it's interesting. And I'm going to leave this as a cliffhanger for now because I want to hear your thoughts. But the other piece of Judith I really am intrigued by is the way it explores somebody who's not Jewish becoming Jewish. Very directly, even more directly than the Book of Ruth, I would argue. But so, Liana, give us some more of your thoughts.
Well, I want to talk about the Shimon piece as well, because I think this is something I always find very interesting, is feeling kind of confused as the book of Genesis tells the story of the lives of the 12 tribes, right? Whether you think that it is tribes to like these 12 people to tribes, or in reverse, we added stories to how we talk about the people who initiated these tribes. Shimon, for me, is pretty fraught because one of the only stories we actually get about him is the story of him finding out when Dinah, at the rape of Dinah, that he is going to, like with Levi, goes and kills all of the men after they've circumcised themselves in the town of Shechem. It's a very upsetting story. It's, an atrocity that he has committed. But what's always intrigued me is that Levi, the other son, gets this redemptive arc as with Moses as his continuation, right? The tribe
and Aaron,
Aaron, they're our main people now, but Shimon gets kind of left aside, which makes me feel like he almost gets all of the blame for what happened, that there's no textual forgiveness that comes through any kind of history that reflects him in a positive light, other than being imprisoned by Joseph or for a few years while his family goes home. But in a story like this, right, I think it reminds me that the story of Levi isn't a redemption story, right? It's a recognition that a tribe is not reflective of how one person acted in our stories, which helps me remember that the stories aren't meant to be prescriptive in that way. I'm not supposed to think that I'm a descendant of any of these tribes, of the tribe of Judah. Therefore, I'm a reflection of Judah, who also acts pretty poorly at the same time as his brothers. When we think about what some of the gaps are in Jewish stories, I think some of it is like the gaps of, hey, our descendants are not necessarily reflections of our ancestors, and we are also continuations of our ancestors. And I think it's cool to find these middle stories where we watch people who we don't actually center most of the time be the center.
That's a really, really cool point. And it's pushing against where I was thinking. I mean, part of me wanted to be like headcanon. The author of the Book of Judith, either literally or in some kind of mythic sense, sees themselves as part of the tribe of Shimon. And so they're pining for what B'nai Lappi might call a donkey story. So we've talked about this on the podcast before, but like B'nai Lappi's famous teaching is that if donkeys read the Torah, they would notice every little tiny detail about donkeys that we just sort of skirt right on past. Or like when it says that like Abraham saddled his donkey and then went off to Mount Moriah, like I think the donkeys would notice a specific set of things about that we wouldn't, because we haven't inhabited that experience. Part of me wants to see this as like a rehabilitative donkey story effort by somebody from the tribe of Shimon who wants to see themselves in Jewish tradition. And obviously Svara, like the organization B'nai Lappi leads, thinks about this through the lens of queerness all the time, like finding stories that may not have been read as queer before, but that we can find those themes. I think the apocryphal books have all sorts of possibilities on that front. And with Judith, the obvious example there is that we have a badass woman who takes the fate of the Jewish people into her hands and succeeds. I do think it's kind of a shame that we haven't centered it in our Jewish tradition. I think the fact that we didn't is a useful teaching for us to notice that we've actually, in all sorts of ways, failed to hold the stories of women that exist in our tradition. But this effort of finding representation, finding stories that are not always in the center of our tradition really matters and has been done for a long time. Like if that Judith author was in some way trying to fill a gap for themselves, we can look at that and say, oh, that's instructing us that we can fill those gaps through our stories today.
Yeah. I want to come back to what you were saying, your cliffhanger, though. And I want you to say more.
Oh, yeah. So my cliffhanger was this guy, Achior. I'm really into this fella, Achior, who pops up in the book of Judith. He is a non-Israelite who, over the course of the story, sort of observes the greatness of the Judeans or the Israelites and actually becomes one, and like literally including circumcision. And I mention that because, look, our show and our organization has been thinking about conversion for a while. And that's another realm where we don't have a ton of representation or donkey stories. Like the book of Ruth is famously read in that way, but the book of Ruth does not say, hey, readers, this person who is not an Israelite becomes an Israelite. It says Ruth is a Moabite. It says that she has a close relationship, perhaps romantic, perhaps not, depends how you read it, with Naomi, that she expresses some beautiful words of connection about Naomi's people will be her people, I'll lodge where you lodge. But it keeps calling her a Moabite for the final bunch of chapters afterwards. And so we don't have an explicit donkey story for conversion. Achior, which I also like to read in my head, Ach means brother, and then Eeyore. So I think of like the Winnie the Pooh character Eeyore a little bit, brother Eeyore. He literally directly, I mean, conversion was different but like he goes from not Judean to Judean or not Israelite to Israelite and seems to be a very positive character. There's nobody like questioning him or like saying, is he sincere? Is he for real? And that is of use in a time now when a lot of converts are getting questioned in all sorts of ways.
I think it's also, I mean, and I don't mean this that it's not a donkey story for folks who are converting or who are coming into our tradition for any number of reasons. And right, I think the fact that it's so rare, but then all of a sudden there's this seamless transition that this person is allowed to make is another point of helpful evidence in any Jewish text of like, oh, right, maybe it's very like one, the fact that I can't find any of these traditions that I have to follow might mean that they weren't there and it's like a later addition. And so like, what does this process mean to me? And also like helpful to ask like, well, what does it mean 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago to become a community member of a community that you had not previously been a part of, right? One that's an identity that is actually very specifically based in tribalism and in location and in family history. And I think what we get to see here, right, the donkey story for me is being like, but they just accept him, right? There's no problem. There's just this assumption that, yeah, like if you, like, you're not a part of us, not because we don't like you, but because you just weren't. And there's a moment of having, like, what does the commitment of joining someone look like? And I love the idea of getting to also watch someone else discover what it means to want to be a part of a community, to be able to look at someone and go, oh, that does reflect my identity in a way that other things I've done in my life haven't yet held. That's very beautiful to me as a way that Apocrypha can also remind us like, oh, right, those stories don't always get told, but that doesn't mean that they weren't there. And it might even mean that they were like so obvious that people forgot they had to say them.
That is so pivotal. So many stories in the books of Apocrypha, I read them and I'm like, of course there was a story about this. Of course people were wondering what's between the gaps in the book of Genesis and therefore had the book of Jubilees, which we talked about last year. Of course, like people needed to reflect on those who were in fact part of their communities who had once not been and who converted or whatever language we might use for that time. Because we haven't canonized these books, we think of what they reflect as somehow like, oh, these show a window at those who were somehow on the side, but still Jewish. Like the notion that the stories that made it in were like always destined to be that way, and they were the true representations of like the center or the mainstream or the norm Jewishly, there's basically no evidence for that. And sometimes there's a lot of counter evidence. Like when we find the Dead Sea Scrolls, a book like Esther is not there at all. And it seems to point to that community not having much of a relationship to it. But many of the books that were not later canonized are all over the place in those scrolls. So that's a teaching for us, and it can help us think about our own time and ways in which those who are marked as marginal or not mainstream may actually be pretty numerous. And I think that is important for us to do. So I think that that's going to be the note that we close this episode with. even as this is a core episode, it's a little shorter than normal. We encourage you, if you were ready to listen to a 50-minute Judaism Unbound episode, but you listen to this one and it's much shorter, go and check out our past year's Apocrypha episodes. You can find them in the show notes for this episode on our website. You can also just go to your podcast app and find our ApocryFest episodes from past years. We also hope that you'll just give yourself a Google deep dive. Look into something that we mentioned today that intrigued you and see what happens, because there's a lot of fascinating stuff out there.
Look at the art that people have made about the Book of Judith.
Yes, absolutely.
There's a lot of it out there.
There's a ton of it, and there's one particularly famous painting, but there's a ton beyond that. And we also want to encourage you to find some time to share with us in Zoom. We're going to be gathering next, as this is released, next Saturday, the 28th of December. If you're listening to this not the day we release it, it might be this coming Saturday. It might be just a couple days from now. It might be today, whatever it is. The 28th of December, we're going to be gathering and sharing Havdalah, are transitioning from Shabbat into the rest of the week, and doing so through the lens of Apocrypha, the lens of these books. We hope that you will come and share that space and time with us. It's going to be fantastic. Liana will be there. It's a Judaism Unbound Torah Studio joint production. We hope that you will join us and tell your friends about it. So we'll close out the episode on that note. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.